All right, so what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. It's 9:31 p.m. where I'm at right now, July 3rd, 2024, and welcome to the channel. And this is part 4 of our second book in our Booked React series, Is the Turk a White Man?, written by Murat Erdogan. It's a 2018 book that we are now on part 4 on. We're stuck in the middle of chapter 3, which is one of the longest chapters in this book, and I'm going to try to get as much reading done as I can today for everybody who's going to come in. Once again, I suggest everybody go pick up these books that we will be reading on this channel, because we want to support our academics, our authors, and everything like that. And you can find this on Amazon for the humble price of only $30 in paperback. So yeah, everybody is welcome into the chat. I will be reading every comment and question that's reasonable in the chat. And we're going to be picking up on chapter 3. And we're starting on page 66. And if you're not caught up in the story, you should just go watch the previous videos on 2x speed and just catch yourself up on everything we have been studying. There's way too much to cover everything that we've spoken about. But one more thing I want to talk about before I jump into the live stream. My guy Sasha Khan, who is a longtime subscriber of mine, sent me an invite on LinkedIn. I got the notification in my email, but I just want to let Sasha Khan know, or anybody who wants to get in contact with me, the best way to reach me is the email that's on this channel in the About section. And secondly, follow me on Twitter, Laji M. Riki. And let's jump ahead. So, starting here, page 66, chapter 3, Encounters with the West. The Young Turk era was characterized by intense and widespread debates about the nature of modernization. The rise of modern journalism provided one of the main forums of discussion among the intellectuals. Disastrous policies followed by the CUP and international relations, especially successive wars with consequent territorial losses in the Balkans and continuing national uprisings among the Christian minorities of the empire, revived the sense of existential crisis and its attendant discourse of saving the states among intellectuals. Young Turk rule intensified the centralization of state power by introducing further administrative reforms. Yet this power, although condensed in the center, was not extensive. The Ottoman state had difficulty collecting taxes to finance the wars fought in the Balkans. In this context, reforms to improve elementary education and to develop industrialization were bound to give only limited results. The entry of the Ottomans to World War I as a result of an impulsive decision by a few powerful members of the pro-German CUP government paved the way for the demise of the empire. Despite successful campaigns in a few fronts, the war sapped the human and economic resources of the empire. After the resignation of the CUP government at the end of the war, a new government was formed and later signed the Armistice of Mudros on October 30th, 1918, with the Allied governments. The plans for the partition of Ottoman territories among members of the alliance were formulated by a number of secret wartime treaties, which became public only after the Soviet Union decided to publicize them. The Treaty of Sevres, signed on August 10th, 1920, formalized the partition of the empire by leaving Istanbul and a part of Anatolia to the Ottoman state, and by placing the rest of the Ottoman territories under French, British, and Italian mandate. The alliance also consented to the Greek occupation of Western Turkey. The opposition of Turkish nationalists to partition under the leadership of the Ottoman general Mustafa Kemal Ataturk led to a widespread resistance movement that eventually resulted in the annulment of the Treaty of Sevres and the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne on July 24th, 1923. Avery Adams says, "Damn, I'm late." No, you just showed up. We just now started the book. I'm literally just starting my first paragraph, but shout out to Avery in the chat. And yeah, chat is open for everybody. I'm going to be reading everything. Continuing here. At least initially, loyalty to Islam and to the Ottoman dynasty was strong among the proponents of the resistance movement. Both at elite and popular levels, resistance was formulated as an effort to save the last bastion of Islam against the transgressions of infidels. The dissolution of the Ottoman parliament in Istanbul by the Allied forces led to the establishment of an independent parliament in Ankara on April 23rd, 1920. But despite the existence of two centers of power, one in Istanbul, the other in Ankara. The only goal of the Ankara government seemed to be saving the Ottoman state. However, Sultan Mehmed VI's opposition to the resistance movement, as well as the increased recognition of the Ankara government by the Allied governments, made it possible to act against the sultanic authority. In the few years between 1919 and 1922, a sea change took place in the political vision of the resistance movement. The Sultan was suddenly expendable, as was his position as caliph, leaders of the Muslim world. The Sultanate was abolished by the parliament in Ankara on November 1st, 1922. On October 29th, 1923, the parliament declared Turkey a republic and appointed Mustafa Kemal as its first president. Ironically enough, decades of stubborn Ottoman efforts to centralize state power facilitated the termination of the Ottoman dynasty. Centralization had created a system in which the power of the state came to be associated with the person or the sultan, with the person of the sultan. The corollary of this was that when the system failed, the sultanate had lost its symbolic value, been reduced to a human scale, and now could be seen as the culprit for all systemic failures. In other words, the mistakes of the sultan as a person justified the annulment of the sultanate itself. A similar process was at work when the caliphate was abolished on March 3rd, 1924, by something as banal as an act of parliament, because what was left of its mystique had been carried away by defeat in the Great War. The Ottoman interest in race. The racial vocabularies of the Republican period have their origins in the episodes of Ottoman modernization. This development should not be considered a teleological necessity. Teleological. I definitely want to look that word up before we continue because I feel like I should know this word. Remember, guys, we're all learning together, so I'm going to sometimes look up words. So, teleological, related to or involving the explanation of phenomenon in terms of the purpose they serve rather than the cause by which they arise. Okay, relating to the doctrine of design and purpose in the material world. Okay, I get it. So, like why something, what purpose something does rather than why it exists in the first place. Okay. So, this development should not be considered a teleological necessity because when history accounts narrate the story of victorious ideas while ignoring others, attempts that went awry, the sense of agency and contingency that is so embedded in history suffers. I want to read that again just to make sure I'm really grasping this. The racial vocabularies of the Republican period have their origins in these episodes of Ottoman modernization. Okay, so when modern Turkey was developed, they pulled from some of the racial vocabularies, how the Turks talked about themselves and others in the paradigm of race. And they didn't just make it up in a vacuum. The Ottomans already were talking about race and their proximity to whiteness and tying it to modernity, right? All right, continuing here. This development should not be considered a teleological necessity, meaning it's not something is that was just done for the sake of having it happen, not just looking at it for the reason why it happened. This development should not be considered a teleological necessity relating to or involving the explanation of phenomenon. Okay, so this should not be looked at in the way of just trying to explain it, like why it happened, because when history accounts narrate the story of victorious ideas while ignoring other attempts that went awry, the sense of agency and contingency that is so embedded in history suffers. I believe I'm grasping that. It's hard for me to reword this, but I'll just say we're not just going to look at the development of the concept of race in modern Turkey in just a vacuum. We're going to look at it from its origin points in Ottoman modernity and not just looking at, the fact that the Ottomans failed, therefore everything that they created, all of their sociological ideas disappeared as well. That's how I'm interpreting that. Sorry if that messed up the flow, but I really want to try to make sure I'm comprehending everything here. So, the emergence of a racial vocabulary as part of the discourse of modernization was the product of a concatenation of contingencies. When Ottoman modernization began to emphasize the power of the central government, an important issue that never mattered in the segmented structure of the millet system emerged, incorporating ethnic and religious diversity under a unitary identity. Although Turkish nationalism, as well as the nationalisms of the empire's constitutive groups, succeeded in establishing such an identity, counterfactual scenarios were possible, in fact, more plausible in the eyes of historical actors. True nationalism appeared to diverse groups throughout the world and may seem to be a global necessity, but the nature of this nationalism was never predetermined. In the Ottoman case, the Turkish awakening of the late Ottoman period that eventually led to the nationalism of the Turkish Republic was only one of the competing paradigms for maintenance of the Ottoman state. Other contenders were attempts to maintain an imperial nationalism and an Islamic unity. Because of this uncertain nature of Turco-centric mobilization in the imperial era, I use the term Turkism, which implies an unambiguous interest for Turkic peoples across the world, but an ambivalent desire for political unification. On the contrary, Turkish nationalism seems to be a more appropriate term for the Republican mobilization around Turkish identity, which had a clear agenda and was mainly nation state oriented. Ozzy jumped into the chat. He says, Salute Simon and Avery Adams. Very interesting topic. Shout out to Ozzy as well. I hope y'all are grasping this book and picking up new things with me because I'm learning as I go and learning a lot of Turkish history right now. But once again, I think this guy is writing from the standpoint of trying to introduced this idea that the Turks perceived themselves as white, or the creation of whiteness was a part of the development of the modern Turkish state, to people who are already, you know, antagonistic to that idea to begin with. Continuing here, Yusuf Anchura, in a landmark article, Uchtaz i Siyaset, Types of Policy, originally published in 1904, discussed the options of emphasizing three types of identities around which the Ottoman Empire could be reorganized. Ottomanism would constitute the attempts to create a civic sense of belonging that would be inclusive of all ethnic and religious groups within the empire. The defining characteristic of the Ottoman identity would be citizenship and allegiance to the person of the Sultan. Islamism, on the other hand, would emphasize the unity of Muslims within and outside the empire. An unending wave of nationalistic uprisings by non-Muslim citizens of the empire in the 19th and early 20th centuries had produced an atmosphere ripe for claims of an Islamic nature. Finally, Turkism would entail redefining the characteristics of the Ottoman state around the Turkishness and extending this Turkish unity beyond the borders of the empire. Very interesting. All right. What is important from a counterfactual point of view is that Yusuf Ankara, a known advocate of Turkism by then, never gives a clear cut answer to the question of whether Ottomanism, Islamism, or Turkism would be the best way to proceed for the Ottoman Empire. Even for Yusuf Ankara, the rise and victory of Turkish nationalism was neither the center, was neither the certain nor the only option. In reality, the boundaries distinguishing Ottomanism, Islamism, and Turkism were not so clear cut. Even the self proclaimed Turkists were hesitant when it came to the outright rejection of Ottoman and Islamic legacies, simply because the possibilities for a strictly national state outside the rubric of the Ottoman state seemed slim. Therefore, many envisioned some sort of a combination, especially of Islamism and Turkism. Even during the nationalist struggle against the Allied forces between 1918 and 1921, resistance clearly stressed religious unity against what was seen as infidel occupation. Only after 1921 do we see a Turkish nationalism, albeit in different interpretations, as a viable option. Modernization seemed to be a desirable tool for the Ottomanist, Islamist, and Turkist alike, although in different degrees and for different ends. At the very beginning of his essay, Akçura himself ties the emergence of these three political possibilities to the emergence of westernization. Since the desire to make progress and become powerful by receiving enlightenment from the West has awakened in Ottoman lands, mainly three political paths, I believe, were considered and followed. The existence of modernization as a meta discourse of transformation available to all helped to increase the fluidity of boundaries between these three policies. Why did Turkish nationalism emerge late compared with minority nationalisms in the Ottoman Empire? That's a very good question. In a context where separatist movements were blossoming, the Muslim Turkish majority of the Ottoman Empire still represented the centrifugal force keeping the empire together. One tendency in Turkish historiography is to present Turkish nationalism as a last resort attempt that was made necessary because of the rise of separatist nationalisms in the Ottoman Empire. For classic examples, see Lewis, 1961, Burkess, 65. Okay, citing sources. A somewhat implicit and sometimes explicit assumption here is that the Ottoman Turkish elite played the nationalism card only when they had to and as a reaction to disloyal minorities. In other words, the late development of Turkish nationalism was a sacrifice done in the name of maintaining the unity of the empire. For example, in a book published by the Official Institute of Ataturk Culture, Language, and History, the author argues that although all other Ottoman ethnic groups claimed ownership of their national identities, Turks were hesitant to use phrases like Turkey and Turkish nation and to defend their own identities openly for the fear that this would accelerate the fragmentation of the state that they established. In this view, the development of Turkishness in the late Ottoman period appears as an almost half hearted and instrumental necessity, a burden shouldered by the goodwill Turkish elite who never wanted to put the unitary nature of the state in jeopardy. This argument is partially true in the sense that the Turkish Ottoman elite had an interest in saving the state they saw was in danger. An Ottoman intellectual, Riza Nur, for example, illustrates that goal in his memoirs in the following way. I am dying for the Turkish ideal, but I'm keeping this ideal in me like a hidden pot and not mentioning it to anyone. I know that if I did, this act would legitimize the secret ideas of other separatist movements in the Ottoman Empire, and this would mean the fragmentation and devastation of the state. This sensitivity for the maintenance of the state is hardly odd or peculiar, however. What would be odd or peculiar is that Turkish nationalism developed early on in an empire that was named by Westerners Turkey, or the Turkish Empire, from its beginning. Sociologically speaking, it is not at all peculiar for powerful groups to try to continue a system that supplies the source of their power. Dominant groups argue for the preservation of a social system until the system itself starts to crumble. In fact, one can argue that the relative lateness of Turkish nationalism turned it into an aggressive nationalism because its late development required extreme measures to catch up in nation building. For this reason, it is important to view the late development of Turkish nationalism within a context of majority minority relations. Turkish nationalism was not simply an innocent consequence produced by the ethnic separatism of unthankful minorities. Despite its radical claims, it was also a conservative movement that aimed at the preservation of traditional power structures. The limitations of a multi ethnic and multi religious empire were the main factors for the relatively late arrival of Turkish nationalism. Perhaps this explains why Turkism in the Ottoman Empire was often conflated with Ottomanism and Islamism. Turkish nationalism did not appear to be a viable alternative in an empire where the ruling elite in Istanbul defined themselves as Turkish. Streams of Turkism emerging in the late 19th century almost never explored Turkish nationalism outside the political possibilities offered by the Ottoman Empire. As early as in the Tanzimat period, the introduction of a national monarchy was meant to unite all peoples living in Ottoman domains. Muslim and non Muslim, Turkish and Greek, Armenian and Jewish, Kurd and Arab. As such, it was a fine example of Benedict Anderson's definition of official nationalism. Later on, Abdul Hamid II created his own official nationalism, a nationalism of Ottomanness, although he was usually blamed for practicing Islamist policies. However, it is not important. However, it is important to note the invention of traditions to create allegiance to the Ottoman state was a considerably secular and rational policy of governing. In fact, the Turkish movement gained momentum during the reign of Abdul Hamid II, despite the official support for Ottomanism. The ensuing Young Turk rule, on the contrary, was frequently blamed for formulating policies of Turkification, although the Union and Progress government was committed both to Islam and Ottomanism as ways of maintaining the allegiance of Muslim and non-Muslim Ottomans. And the Young Turk government deliberately recruited more Arabs into the framework of the central government as bureaucrats. Of course, some of the Young Turk intellectuals were pursuing Turkism and assimilationist goals, especially in Turkish societies, but certain attempts that looked like examples of Turkish policies, such as the simplification of Ottoman Turkish and making it the administrative language of the empire, were meant to be gestures of centralization, standardization, and rationalization rather than Turkification. Interesting. Going here to the comment section, Ozzy. So is he saying that Turkish nationalism was only wanted by the ruling class? I would argue that yes. Yes. I mean, the thing is, whenever they speak about that transition from the Ottoman period to the Republican period, there really is no way of knowing what the average Turkish person wanted at that time. Now, the story is told through history books and just in conversation amongst people who talk about this topic that the average Turkish person didn't know what the hell was going on. They had their traditions, they had their ways, they had their religion, which was Islam, and they sort of went with the flow when the top guys, the elites, the educated folks said, okay, this is what we're doing now. Now, instead of being Ottomans, y'all are Turks. You don't have to wear the hijab anymore. We're going to change the Arabic on the Adhan. We're no longer writing in Arabic script. We're now going to write in Latin letters. We don't know exactly, from my understanding, we don't know exactly what the average common Turkish person wanted. So, yes, I think he is implying that the ruling class wanted the sort of Turkish nationalism. And he's writing about here that there were three different ideas of what the Turkish state could be. Could it be a neo Ottoman thing where we might have now a republic, right? But we're still going to consider our subjects or the citizens of the nation as Ottomans, right? And what unifies us is our shared Ottoman history, being together in this unified, multi-religious, multi-ethnic state, right? Then there was the idea of a unified Islamism that unified Turkey, right? Like, we are all Muslims. We should not look at color, brother. We do not see color, brother. And let's unify under Islam as the ruling thing for Turkey. Then there was the idea of Turkishness and Turkism, right? Which is a very broad thing because the people of Turkey are just one branch of the Turkish people, right? Like, there are different types of Turks. Some even say the Hungarians are a type of Turks because they come from Central Asia. Some people might even say the Finnish people are types of Turks because they speak a Uralic language and stuff like that. So, it gets kind of fuzzy. But they sort of ended up going with Turkism, right, as the idea, and the nationalism that they created because they were so late in the game became very aggressive to try to maintain the state, right? Continuing here. So, in addition to being relatively late and conflated with other perspectives, Turkism in the Ottoman Empire, in terms of its sources, was not local. The sources of most of the Turkish mobilization in the Ottoman period, with its ethnic, racial, and linguistic streams, were located outside the empire among Turkic-speaking emigres, mostly from the Russian Empire. This is, of course, a truism in the sense that national identities, by definition, have to be invented by those who originally did not subscribe to that identity. Only after the establishment and reinforcement of a particular national identity can one see the transformation of invention into discovery. Frenchness, for example, cannot be invented by the French, since the act of invention implies the existence of a previously different identity. But it can very well be discovered by the French. Beyond this truism, however, what is rather unexpected in the Turkish case is to find that individuals who were influential in manufacturing Turkishness during the late Ottoman era were mostly born and educated not only outside the territories of contemporary Turkey, but also outside the Ottoman Empire. This is partially due to the reason that the nation state, as a form of political existence in the modern world, has practically acquired universal dominance that makes it one of the quintessential political projects of modernity. Still, beyond the general picture lie concrete factors in the invention of national consciousness, not only in the ethnic center of the Ottoman Empire, but also among minorities. The Ottoman Turkist movement, which was developed by the Turkic speaking emigres in the empire and by intellectuals in Europe, shows striking contrast to Republican Turkish nationalism. The latter was more inward looking because it's limited its territorial interest to modern Turkey. On the contrary, the anti imperialist Turkism of Turkic speaking emigres was more concerned with the preservation of homelands and with some vague sense of Turkic unity. Despite such apparent incongruities. I don't know why I can't speak today, guys. Bear with me. Bear with me. I'm tripping over my words today. Maybe it's because I haven't read it in a long time, like since Sunday, right? Since I did my last live stream. Anyway, despite such apparent incongruities, there are important continuities between Ottoman Turkism and the Republican discourse of nationalism and race. The term Turk in the Ottoman Empire was broadly used as a derogatory term referring to unrefined nomads in Anatolia. Although Western anthropology had a well formed racial understanding of Turkishness in the 19th century that liberally sprinkled scholarly texts with phrases like Turkish blood, Turanian stock, typical Turkish skull, and typical Turkish crania. Oh my God. Like I said, science 100 years ago was totally different. Like they were literally taking it seriously that there were different races of people with their own sort of biological structures and personality types. It's crazy. Like they used to think the world was divided by like characters from Middle Earth. Anyway, continuing. Uh, uh, Ozzy says, "Yep, it's amazing how far science has come." Right? Yeah, it's amazing that how far science has come, but still, that a lot of these ideas still persist amongst people. That's the big problem. That there are different races of people with their own sort of like superpowers or different sorts of characteristics. Continuing here. The cosmopolitan subjects of the empire living in large cities never considered themselves Turks. This was about to change toward the end of the 19th century when two developments coincided. On the one hand, Orientalist scholarship gained momentum with new archaeological and anthropological discoveries in Asia, and the rising interest in Turkish speaking peoples eventually led to the establishment of Turkology in European universities. Turkology, that's hilarious. This body of scholarship attracted the fancy of Ottoman intellectuals with its generally positive evaluation of Turks and competed with the anti Ottoman opinions then prevalent throughout Europe. The second development was the emigration of a large number of Turkish speaking intellectuals, such as Yusuf Ankara from the Russian Empire, for fear of persecution in search of asylum in the Ottoman Empire. The combination of these two trends was influential in the creation and the spread of a racialized Turkism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Very interesting, very interesting. You know, I don't know if any of you guys like ever look up the biographies of like some of those um, uh, freedom fighters in Africa, right? Like the people who fought the British or fought the French to get like out of their country. A lot of those people, right? They become ultra nationalists when they leave their nation. Like I believe Kagame, Paul Kagame, who is the leader of Rwanda, right? He went to go study in the U.S. or France, one of those nations, right? And while he's studying in the U.S., he becomes hyper nationalistic about what's happening in Rwanda and then goes back there to try to free his country, I believe, from the French or the British. I don't know, because in Rwanda, it's crazy because I think they were colonized by both the British and the French, right? And that story is sort of like repeated with so many other like nationalist heroes from nations where they fought for their independence against colonialism, right? Very common to hear about that sort of thing. And that made me just think about, you know, all these intellectuals that go abroad and then come back to the nation to try to do something. I'm not trying to draw parallels for myself or anything like that because I don't think I'll ever go back to America, but it's sort of like a repeating pattern, right? You notice that people rep their hometown more when they go to college out of state, right? Anyway, continuing here. European Orientalists. Leon Cajon, 1841 to 1900, had an undeniable influence on the development of Turkism in the 19th century. His work built a bridge between late Ottoman Turkish intellectuals and the Republican nationalist elite. An avid traveler, Cajon developed an interest in the history of Asia in the 1870s. As one of the participants in the First International Congress of Orientalists held in Paris in 1873, his presentation entitled The Habitat and Prehistoric Migrations of the Races called Turanian. Turanian. I've never heard of that term before. Turanian. I'm going to call my wife a big booty Turanian from now on. Anyway, uh, all right, his work drew the attention of Ottoman intellectuals who were looking for ways to counter anti Ottoman views in Europe. In this presentation, Cahun claimed that an interval C existed in Central Asia in prehistoric times. The disappearance of this internal sea following changes in the climate. There's typos in this book. The disappearance of this internal sea following changes in the climate resulted in the migration of Turkic peoples out of Central Asia to the north and west. The key point was his idea that the Turks, not the Aryans, as was commonly believed then, were the native peoples of Europe. Oh God. Once origins were established, Cahun and others went on to look for the racial and linguistic purity of the Turks. This is crazy. This is literally crazy. Cahun's rather convoluted set of arguments paved the way for many concurrent themes in the Turkish race: the geographic vastness of the Turkish world, the ancientness of the Turkish language, the historically unchanging nature of Turkish culture, and the contributions of the Turks to world civilization are a few of the ideas that circulated throughout Republican history. This is this guy really, really, really wanted some Turkish pussy. This man was obsessed with Turkish girls. I can tell. I'm reading through it. Mr. Cahun went to Istanbul and then he met a big booty bro. He met a big booty Turanian who turned him out. This is a crazy theory. That's a crazy theory. Okay, so a long time ago, in Central Asia, there was like a large river in flood or something, right? He thinks that there was this large body of water that then dried up, which caused the people of Central Asia to then migrate westward, and then they ended up in Europe, right? That doesn't make sense when you think about it, because in Europe they speak Indo-Iranian languages, right? Like most of the languages of Europe can be tied back to Iran and India, right? Indo-Iranian languages like English, like German, right? Like French to some degree. Well, French is more Latin, right? But there's a lot of Indo-Iranian languages, you know, in in Europe. So how are you going to get Turkic languages? Like there's only like two Turkic languages in Europe, which I believe is Finnish and I believe Hungarian, right? I don't get this. Like, how would you even come up with that theory? Anyway, this was he thought of that like well over 150 years ago. So anyway, continuing here. All right, to see the significance of Cahun's work in this regard, we need only look at one of the early attempts by the new Republican regime to formalize and popularize a history of Turkishness in the form of an official history book entitled The Central Themes of Turkish History, and prepared by a committee of politicians and scholars. The book, intending to unite all the scientific findings on the roots and characteristics of the Turks and to become a scientific reference manual, carried important historical, linguistic and racial claims. I will return to a more detailed discussion of this book later, but suffice it to say now that it was the predecessor of history textbooks in the Republican era. What is important as far as Cahun's work is concerned is that a complete translation of a conference given by Cahun called The Turanian Roots of the Language Used in France Before the Aryan Languages was included in the book. Inclusion of Cahun's conference presentation in an officially sanctioned book indicates that the Republican elite explicitly considered Cahun a Western scientific expert friendly to Turkish claims, despite his questionable attempt to establish linguistic links between the names of towns in France and those in Central Asia based merely on superficial linguistic resemblances. Based on linguistic evidence, Afet Inan, an important ideologue of the Republican era, as well as one of Ataturk's adopted daughters, felt confident enough to claim in an earlier Turkish translation of Cahun's conference paper that it is the Turks who establish all ancient civilizations. So basically, back in the day, the the leaders of Turkey, like the late Ottomans, like 10 years away from there being no more Ottomans, they basically met this white guy from Europe who was like the David Icke of his time, who had wild theories. He had wild theories that ancient Europeans actually came from Central Asia. They were actually Turkish people. And his proof for that was saying, like, hey, in Mongolia, they have a town called Baris. So that compares to Paris. So the Turks and the Europeans are the same. Like, what? That's crazy. That's crazy. Like, oh, that's pretty funny. But that goes to show, if you're white in this world, if you're a white person in this world and you choose to be the mouthpiece for like oppressed people, or like people who are not in proximity to whiteness, they will like cling to you, right? Like, imagine if Simon Hill, Keeps It Trill, were a white man talking about white supremacy all the time. I would have a ton more black people on my channel saying, yeah, get him, Simon, get him, lay them crackers down. If I was white doing the same work that I'd be doing, I'd be bigger than Tim Wise. I'd be bigger than Barack Obama. I'd be bigger than Trump. Because nobody loves white people more. Nope, nope, no. Black people love a white person who speaks up for black people more than they love black people who do it. Right? It's like facts. So the Turks basically got a white man who was willing to say that the Turkish people were the root of everything, and they like showered him with praise and paid him and supported him and everything. Crazy. Continuing here. So where were we? So, ha ha ha. Okay. So where were we? So Cahun's major work, Introduction to the History of Asia, 1896, was well received in the Ottoman Empire. The publication of this book took place a few years after an archaeological discovery, the Orhun inscriptions. These inscriptions, which date back to the early 8th century CE, were the first examples of a written Turkic language. Located to the west of today's Ulaanbaatar, the inscriptions were regarded by Wilhelm Thomson, the Danish Turkologist who deciphered the inscriptions, as the oldest monuments of a pre-Islamic Turkic civilization. Cahun's book was a simplified summary of the Turkological findings of the period, including the inscriptions. His flattering treatment of pre-Islamic Turkish civilization carried over to the Republican era, especially because Cahun drew a picture of ancient Turkish society that was radically different from prevalent opinions in Europe. Ancient Turks were defined by sentiments of justice, equality between men and women, efficient social organization, hierarchy, and discipline. In short, they exhibited the characteristics of an ideal modern society. Cahun's work also used a combination of racial, linguistic, and historical arguments to further his earlier contention that European civilization was established by Turanian peoples who migrated from Central Asia. Cahun's history had widespread appeal among Turkologists of the period because it was seen as the most comprehensive work combining a variety of new findings. A review of the work in the American Historical Review, for example, presents it as follows. While nearly all of the sources of information of Mr. Cahun have for many years been familiar to Oriental scholars, it cannot be but admitted that his comprehensive arrangement of the materials at his command and the general conclusions he has been able to draw from them will be appreciated as positive and valuable contributions towards a better knowledge of the intricate problems of Asiatic history. Okay, so that's what his, historical contemporaries were saying about him at the time. That, yeah, basically he's doing like very interesting and valuable work to understanding Asian history. They didn't fully say that they agree with his conclusion that the that the ancestors for Europeans are actually Turks, but it's still, they still thought it was worthwhile, right? Because it fit in also with like racial science at the time. Like back then, they were making up everything, right? Everything except the actual truth, which is that all people come from Africa and the first Europeans were black. Like this is historically fact. Like look at Cheddar Man. I did a whole live stream about how ancient Europeans were basically all black, and over a course of a few thousand years, phenotypes changed because of the lack of sunlight and stuff like that. Like it's been proven fact now through actual DNA evidence, not linguistic reconstructions of names and places and stuff like that, that the ancient Europeans were black. But back then, 150 years ago, during the race science heyday, they were just making up all sorts of stuff. Ancient Chinese people climbed up out of holes from the ground and then populated all of the Sino land. Like they were just making up anything. Anyway, continuing here. Several other 19th century European scholars exerted influence on the late Ottoman and early Republican notions of Turkish race, language, and history. Konstantin Borchesky is one of them. Borzecki, sorry, Konstantin Borzecki had to seek asylum first in France and then in the Ottoman Empire in 1849 after his involvement in Polish nationalist uprisings against Russia and Austria in 1848. After joining the Ottoman army upon his arrival in Istanbul, Borzecki converted to Islam, took a Muslim name, Mustafa Celaleddin, and married to the daughter of an Ottoman General Omer Lutfi Pasha. Mustafa Kala, uh, Celaleddin. I'm gonna call him Chela. Mustafa Cella's book on ancient and modern Turks turned out to be a prominent source of reference for Ottomans and later Republican Turkists. Author de Gobineau's now infamous essay on the inequality of human races was circulating widely in Europe and North America at the time, and his influence. Essay on the inequality of human races. See, that's what it was like back then. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I misread that because it's so I would just imagine like a scientist to write like the essay on the equality. I'm sorry, author de Gobineau's now infamous essay on the inequality of human races was circulating widely in Europe and North America at the time, and his influence was obvious on Mustafa Cella. As Gobineau's claim concerning the innate superiority of the white race became popular, Mustafa Cella accepted it at face value and did what so many Republican scholars were going to do 60 years later, tried to convince Westerners of the Europeanness and whiteness of Turks for the purpose of switching categories in Gobineau's taxonomy. According to Yusuf Ankshira's report on the history of Turkism, published in 1928, we encounter in Mustafa Cella's book the following idea for the first time in Ottoman history: the strength and breadth of the Turkish race, the great role this race played in the history of humanity, the richness of the Turkish language that does not require any help from other languages, the contributions of the Turkish language to other languages, the relationships among Turks that are spread to a wide area in Asia and Europe, the drawbacks of not valuing the idea of Turkishness in the Ottoman states, the necessity of connecting the non Muslim Ottoman citizens to the Turkish masses through ties of language and race. Basically, just pumping out his chest saying, yeah, the Turks are great and blah, blah, blah, and stuff like that. This is the thing, man. Once again, if you're white, you can get almost anything in this world. This man showed up in Turkey, didn't speak a lick of the language, right? Converted to Islam, and then was able to marry the general's daughter. And in return for having sort of the world laid down at his feet at that time, he basically writes books trying to be the white man speaking up for the Turks against other white men who were claiming that the Turks were an inferior race to white people, right? Anyway, continuing here. Some of the methods of reasoning the Mustafa Cella, some of the methods of reasoning that Mustafa Cella used to link ancient Turks to modern Europe would later constitute the basis of many standard arguments in the Republican racial, linguistic, and historical mobilization, especially the favored methods of linguistic comparison, in which similarities of morphology and lexicon in different languages are traced to a proto-language usually considered to be Turkish. In this sense, that Turkish and Latin have some similar sounding words was sufficient for Mustafa Cella to declare their linguistic relationship. A more comprehensive method of reasoning was to present a claim as proven unless it could clearly be negated. If the origins of Etruscans, according to this reasoning, cannot be known definitively, they must be nothing but ancient Turks. Everybody's Turkish. Everybody's Turkish, guys. If you This is the rule of life. If you don't know the answer to a question about history, just say it was the Turks. It was Turks. That's crazy. I need to blow my nose real quick. I think I got allergies. Oh. Oh, sorry about that. Here in Budapest, I think there's a lot of pollen in the air. Summer is here. Sometimes it's raining at night, so then that all that stuff from the earth gets up in the air. Anyway, very funny how these ancient scientists, like these social scientists from the past, thought about race and people. Anyway, Mustafa Cella's son, Enver Cella, closely followed his father's intellectual trajectory. A series of articles he published throughout 1917 and 18 clearly reveals the continuities between the Republican discourse of Turkishness and the racialized discourse of Ottoman Turkish. For Enver Cella, the ancient Turks, who are our ancestors, are members of the white race, and they are the oldest, perhaps the first among the nations that belong to the mentioned race. This matter can be proven with history, geography, and language. This was precisely the strategy employed in the articles. Using a potpourri of historical, geographical, and linguistic arguments, Enver Cella's vehemently denied European claims that Turks should be classified with the Chinese, Mongols, and Tartars. However, connections with Mongoloid races were not rejected, especially in contexts where the author could assert that Turks assimilated these races without losing their own essential identities. A problematic approach toward Europe in these essays, revealing a suggested European conspiracy to classify Turks as part of the yellow race, but also an immense desire to be considered racially European, seems to be an early example for the Republican double consciousness, simultaneously suspicious and admiration of the West. All right, simultaneous suspicion and admiration of the West. Sorry. There is evidence that Ataturk, the founder of the republic, had keen interest in the Turkological literature throughout his career. There is no doubt that he had the chance to read Ceyhun's book as a young Ottoman army officer, as did many other members of the Ottoman elite at the turn of the century. Ataturk maintained his interest in Ceyhun's work during the Republican period. Some of the sentences Ataturk underlined in a paragraph indicate the type of information that was interesting for the Ottoman and Republican modernizers. Until science and method supplanted faith and brute force, the Turks and the Mongols dominated Asia and Eastern Europe. Religious enthusiasm played hardly any part in their wonderful fortune. At the time of their greatest power, their typical empire, that of the Mongols, had no well defined religion, but all that could be done with the sword the Turks and Mongols accomplished. In them, is incarnated the military spirit. Their virtues are those of true warriors, courage, obedience, straightforwardness, good sense. They have been careful governors, firm administrators, far from scorning arts and science. They have done homage to intellectual processes. They have endeavored to adopt them to make them natural to themselves. But the mold of their original thought was too narrow and misshapen to contain and transform the civilization of Persia and China. Confined to such a mold, it burst it asunder and lost every trace of the form which the natural correctness and clearness of view that characterized the Turk had sought to impart to it. I just want to be absolutely clear on this. Some of the sentences Ataturk underlined in a paragraph indicate the type of information that was interesting for the Ottoman and Republican modernizers. So this is a part in this text that Ataturk thought was particularly interesting, and he underlined it in the book from Kahun, who was the white guy from Europe who went to Turkey and basically became an apologist for the Turks in their claim to whiteness, right? Ugh. Sorry about that, guys. Sorry. I need to take a lozenge or something. I don't know. Anyway, very interesting that that Ataturk would see this, because I believe there is some exceptionalism, racial exceptionalism, in what he is writing here. Right? I mean, this should be unnatural for anybody to think, or it's unfortunately the way some people think, but it's not backed up by any proof, that because in the past your people conquered a bunch of land, or they were warriors in the past, or whatever, that now that somehow seeps into your blood and that becomes your predisposition, right? That's not how evolution works. That's not how science works. That's not how people work. But it's interesting that Ataturk thought that that could be a way, I guess, of unifying Turkishness or defining Turkishness, right? Continuing here. So, as can be judged from the markings in the margins of his personal copy, Ataturk also had a personal interest in Mustafa Celaddin's book. The following issues in Les Turcs, Ancient et Modern, seem to have been especially interesting for him. The fact that peoples that settled in Turkey consisted mostly of Aryans, and some of them were Turks, the falsity of accusations against Turks as an uncivilized nation, the negative effects of the Islamic Caliphate for Turkish society, the Turkic origins of the Etruscans, and the Turkic origins of medieval scholars with Arabic names. It is important to emphasize that early Turkologists' positive view of the Turkish language, history, or race is partially in the eye of the beholder. This body of work was clearly received differently by Turkish and Western publics. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Turkish and Ottoman intellectuals, scholars, and politicians applied a lens of reinterpretation when they discussed Western publications that are considered to have a positive in books, or to stretch a small passage praising Turks beyond any recognizable form, or to claim a blanket Turkish ownership to the cultural achievements of distant and fuzzy groups in Orientalist writings, such as the Iranians, Mongolians, or Asians. What fueled these reinterpretations was the depth of Orientalist imagery of the Turks in the West. Naturally, European and North American scholars took some of the outlandish claims of early Turkologists with a grain of salt when they decided to pay attention to them. For example, a review of a book on Islam in the American Historical Review in 1922 does not distinguish Cahun's account of Turks as a positive one. After the author quotes a passage from the book under review indicating how the Turks and Mongols object was not conquest for settlement, not even loot, but in great part a sheer satanic lust for blood and destruction. He compares this view to Cahun's as follows. Leon Cahun sees more method in their madness. While Cahun in Turkey was received as giving a glowing reevaluation of Turkish history, others in the centers of the scholarly world saw little or no such revisionism. Basically, what they're saying here is that Cahun was trying to make it seem like, yeah, the Turks were white and they were great because they conquered and they killed and they stomped all over the world, and then the at least in North America, like the historical societies of his time said, yeah, that's not good, buddy. That makes your people seem even more savage. You get what I'm saying? Because think about this, right? Think about this. When white people talk about their empires, right? When the British talk about their empire, when the Portuguese talk about their empire, when the French talk about their empire, they don't say the truth that they literally stomped all over the world, genocided people, raped, pillaged, burned down entire civilizations, right? Like they don't tell the truth like that. What they say is like, we came to Latin America and we brought science, modernization, and stuff like that. Like even now, when we talk about Africa, a lot of people say Africa is destroyed and it's messed up and it's dirty and ignorant and in the dark and backwards, but they never mention the part that the Europeans stomped all over the continent. 30 million black people died in the Congo, in the Free State of Congo, just because of one man, Leopold, the King of Belgium, right? Like they don't talk about that part, because when the Europeans talk about their history, they say we came there and we came to civilize and we came to liberate the woman, right? That was Napoleon's whole thing. Napoleon showed up in Egypt and said, we're going to conquer Egypt because we're here to bring enlightenment to these backwards people and liberate the woman, right? So yeah, it's crazy because in Cahun's mind and in a lot of other people's minds, they believe because somebody conquered another group of people, you should hype that thing up and make your strength seem like a positive thing when it's not, right? Anyway, Ozzy jumped into the comments and said, damn, Cahun was deriding the Turks like crazy. Yes, he was. Yes, he was. But he would do anything for a big booty Turanian, as you see. If you get a big booty Turanian, for a big booty Turanian, you'll write books about the greatness of the Turks all day. Continuing here, another European source of Turkism was a group of scholars in Hungary and scholarly debates taking place around the Hungarian language. In the second half of the 19th century, a linguistic debate played an important role in the formation of the Hungarian national identity. The main point of the debate was to find out if the Hungarian language was a Ural Altaic language into which Turkic languages were also classified, or a Finno-Ugric language. The debate soon turned into a broader symbolic struggle to identify groups with which the Hungarians could claim cultural and ethnic bonding. Classifying the Hungarian language as Finno-Ugric ended up being accepted by the majority of the Hungarian scholarly community as a more plausible alternative at the turn of the 20th century. However, the implications of the debate went beyond linguistic discussions when a group of Hungarian academics invented the notion of the Turan, which, among other assertions, lumped the Ural Altic and Finno Ugric language into a single family of languages. The Turan referred to a racial, cultural, linguistic, and historical unity among peoples as diverse as the Hungarians, Finns, Turks, Estonians, Bulgarians, Tartars, Turkmens, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, and Bashkirs. This list, some argued, could even be extended to the Japanese, Koreans, Mongolians, Chinese, Siamese, and Tibetans. Anybody who wants to be white, if you want to be white, just sign up for this list. Sign up for this list. This is the Turan list. Get on this list quick because the space is filling up. Get on the list quick. Come on, guys. Quick, quick, quick. We're all trying to make the Turkish people white. The Hungarians are white. They speak our language. We are white too, nigga. I'm tripping. Sorry. Sorry. Anyway, the Hungarian intellectuals considered Hungary to be the leader of a Turanian unity, while some Turkish intellectuals, for whom the lure of the Turanian ideal proved irresistible, had the Turks in mind when looking for a leader for Turanian peoples. The relations between Turkish and Hungarian intellectuals committed to the pan-Turanian unity continued throughout the late Ottoman and early Republican periods. Hungarian Orientalist Armin van Bury was an influential figure in the development of a racialized Turkism. Van Bury, after staying for 4 years in Istanbul, started a 3 year long trip through Asia in dervish clothes. His impressions of the trip were published in English, Hungarian, and Turkish. In 1870, Van Bury established the Department of Turkology at the University of Budapest, which was the first independent at a university dedicated to the study of Turks. And research continued afterward well into the 1940s. A Society of the Turan was established in 1910. Its counterpart in the Ottoman Empire was established a year later. The idea of a Turanic unity did not last long in Hungary, but the rhetorical appeal of Turanism operated as a major influence in the Turkish political spectrum in early Republican period and has continued until today. What is interesting is that Turanism in Turkey functioned along more racialized lines than it did in Hungary. The superiority of the Turkish race was a central concept of the Turanist in Turkey. However, among the Hungarian Turanists, the idea of the superiority of Hungarian or Turanian race was virtually non existent. Continuing here, Turkic intellectuals. Russian advances in the Central Asian region known as Turkestan, literally the land of the Turks, and the attendant Ottoman retreat in these areas in the second half of the 19th century provided another impetus for a rising Turkish consciousness among Ottoman intellectuals, which coincided with the increasing Orientalist interest in Turkishness and the rising tide of Turkology in Europe. The consequences of Russian expansion were more than simply sympathy among the Ottomans for the plight of Turkic peoples caught in the imperial conflict between the Romanovs and the Ottomans. Perhaps more significantly, Russian advances resulted in a concrete intellectual link between Turkestan and the Ottoman Empire. A group of Turkish speaking intellectuals had to escape Russian lands because their Turkist and nationalist agenda was not tolerated within the Russian imperial order. They sought refuge in several European countries, but mostly in the Ottoman anti-Russian sentiments, and a broad Turkic awakening. These Muslim emigre intellectuals were not part of the ruling elite in the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, as opposed to their Ottoman counterparts, they had fewer stakes in maintaining the Ottoman multinational mode. They had considerable influence on the formation of Turkishness, not only through their intellectual writings in journals and newspapers, but also through their direct political involvement in Turkish politics in the late Ottoman and early Republican periods. Yusuf Ankara, whose groundbreaking 1904 article, Three Types of Policy, discussed Turkism as a possible candidate for ascendancy in the future, was one of these prominent Turkish speaking emigre scholars. In both his intellectual and his political involvements, he was truly a bridge between Ottoman era Turkism and the Republican formation of Turkish nationalism. Ankara was especially instrumental in the Republican efforts to rewrite Turkish history. Although many of his influential ideas were formed during the Ottoman era, Ismail, who was originally born in Crimea, also contributed to the ideal of Turkic unity. During his travels in Europe, he met with Ottoman exiles that were critical of Sultan Abdul Hamid II's rule. His bilingual Turkish and Russian newspaper, Turkman, was widely read among Ottoman intellectuals. Ahmed Agolu represented a more liberal and modernist wing among the emigre intellectuals and was deeply influenced by the French Enlightenment during his stay in Paris between 1888 and 1894. In fact, his Turkism was an extension of his support for Westernization. Therefore, he presents a fine example of the way Turkishness and modernity cooperated in the Republican period. And while Zeki Velid Togan belongs to a later generation, having left Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, he still had a great influence on late Ottoman Turkism. He taught Turkish history in the Republican era, but had to leave Turkey because of his dissent from Ataturk's views and his criticism of some of the outlandish claims of official historical theses about the origin of the Turks. Most of the Turkish speaking emigre intellectuals were defending some type of unity among the Turkic peoples of the world. In fact, this was one of the characteristics that separated them from the Ottoman born Turkish scholars, who were not very receptive to the political ideas of Turkic unity. The Ottoman born scholars had complex allegiances that incorporated Ottomanist and Islamist identities. For implicit or explicit demotion of Islam and Ottomanism to supporting roles was not easy to accept for many Ottoman. Although a political and intellectual mobilization against what was perceived as the regime of Abdul Hamid II existed, and a majority of the intellectuals who were part of this mobilization also participated in the second constitutional movement that started with Union and Progressist parties' rise to power in 1908. This mobilization did not necessarily turn into a movement opposed to the Ottoman dynasty. The Sultan's persona and the imperial order remained distinct in the minds of Ottoman intellectuals. The different worldviews of emigre and Ottoman intellectuals can be seen in relatively lively debates taking place in a number of journals published in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in journals such as Turk Neji, Genç Kalma, Turk Yurdu, and Islam Mekmausa, Megmashi, the Turkish discourse appears to be dominated by emigre scholars. For example, in the journal Turk Deneji, all the articles that had to do with Central Asia were published by intellectuals who had emigrated from Russia. In conjunction with European inspired Turkology, Turkish speaking emigres, scholars, produced the majority of the early examples of the historical, linguistic, and racial themes that we will encounter again in the Republican era. The ancientness of the Turkish language and its links with many other languages, which sought to establish Turkish as the roots of other languages, the ancientness of Turks and their ethnic and racial connections to other ancient civilizations, and the necessity of forming strong ties with peoples who were considered Turks, especially in Central Asia. The Ottoman intellectuals were more reluctant to engage in a wholesale Turkish policy. For many, the idea of Ottoman citizenship beyond linguistic and ethnic lines was still a possibility. Some of them even presented the the United States as an example of the way to accomplish this in the modern world. In an article published in 1909, Zia Golkop, a major figure with whom we will meet soon, suggested the United States both as an example of progress and a possibility of regenerating the idea of Ottoman citizenship. Even those who accepted emphasizing a Turkish identity within the Ottoman context imagined it as a tool to hold the entire Ottoman system together. In other words, as opposed to the emigres who strived to discover Turkishness, for the Ottoman scholars, Turkishness could only be an invention for rather pragmatic reasons. They saw the invention of Turkishness as state centered, as saving the state, whereas the discovery proposed by the emigres was expected to go beyond existing state boundaries in search of a vague cultural and racial unity. The emigres' notion of the discovery of Turkishness served to lend a sense of immutability to racial, linguistic, and cultural identifications and contrast them with the artificial boundaries of the empire. As Turkish nationalist discourse was consolidated in the 1930s, however, we see an increasingly obstinate turn away from an even periodic suppression of the idea of pan-Turkic unity, at least at the level of official policy, simply because the ideal of Turkic unity posed a direct threat to the territorial integrity of the Soviet Union. Despite these setbacks, the specter of pan Turkism has always been present in Turkish nationalism for two reasons. First, the pan Turkist ideals existed in various shades in the political spectrum, despite their exclusion from the very centers of power. In the 1980s, pan Turkist rhetoric slowly penetrated the official discourse, this time mixed with the rhetoric of Islam. The so called Turkish Islamic synthesis, intended to protect youth from communism, was actively propagated by the military government that remained in power for 3 years after the 1980 coup. Second, the discursive framework of Turkishness still shares common ground with pan Turkism, although the overlaps should not imply a perfect fit. The broad idea of a shared Turkish essence necessarily raises perceptions immutability, and continuity across time and space. Therefore, differences as far as the viability of territorial Turkic unity do not necessarily lead to a disagreement as to the desirability of that goal. I gotta blow my nose. These allergies are killing me. Ooh, sorry about that. Anyway, summarizing everything we just read, basically, from what I understood, my reaction to that is that, okay, about 100 or so years ago, there were like these radical Turkish people living in Russia who wanted to unify Turkic people. But if you know geography, we know that Russia occupies a large part of Central Asia. And what's right below Russia? Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, a bunch of really Turkic people, people that speak a similar language to Turkish, et cetera, and they have a similar history. And plus, they're Muslim as well. Russia didn't like that at the time because the last thing they want is, nationalist, secessionist like movements amongst them or people getting too riled up, especially in Russia, because there's always been a large subsection of the Russian population that has been Turkic, right? Right. So, yeah, they kicked them out. They go to Turkey, like these emigres leave Russia, go to Turkey. They continue to try to like write their books and give speeches about their ideas of pan-Turkic unity and the creation of this Turkishness, this Turkic identity that will unify all of them. And the people that were already in Turkey trying to think about what this new society will look like, they were already coming up with Turkishness, but they weren't looking at it from the perspective like the Turks have always existed. They'll say now the Turks exist now. We're going to create this new identity of Turkishness. Those are the two conflicting ideas that sort of came to a head, right? And the government and the and the government and the intellectuals, ebbed and flowed as to which type of identity they wanted to use for the sake of whatever they were hoping to accomplish, right? Ah, sorry about my allergies, everybody. Woo, this summer. I hate summer so much. I love winter. I just need to live at the North Pole. Seriously. I hate being hot. I hate allergies. I don't like the sun. I don't like anything. Anyway, continuing here. Oh no. Hold on, wait. Let's close that. All right. So, uh, Zia Golkop, the official ideologue of the Republic. Zia Golkop, born 1876 and died in 1924, was not an outside added influence. Born in the borders of the empire and involved with the Committee of Union and Progress, he was an Ottoman intellectual at heart. However, Goldcap had a formative influence on Turkish nationalism. Goldcap did not directly advocate European race theories. Instead, his attempts to identify Turkish identity and, while doing that, deal with the influence of Western civilization, the Ottoman and Islamic legacy, and Turkic ideals left an ideological framework on which the Republican narrative of Turkishness was built. Having lived in a period of crisis, revolution, and war, like his contemporaries, he was faced with the problem of maintaining the Ottoman state while creating a coherent collective identity from Islamic, Ottoman, Turkish, and Western sources of inspiration. But instead of emphasizing one at the expense of others, Goldcap attempted to create an original synthesis. His efforts were also the most influential ones politically of all the Turkish nationalist intellectuals. As the ideological father of Republican nationalism, Goldcap's Turkism served as a tool to ease the transition from a multi ethnic empire to a nation state. His work is a bridge between the imperial and nationalist periods in the sense that Goldcap could be called the official ideologue of the Committee of Union and Progress and the unofficial ideologue of the Republican regime. Goldcap's intellectual formation took place under the rule of Abdul Hamid II. Despite the fact he was from a provincial origin, Diyarbakir, and hence was geographically distant from the center of the empire, Goldcap followed a political and intellectual trend in Istanbul closely. Goldcap followed political and intellectual trends in Istanbul closely. Goldcap's father wished him to receive both a traditional and a Western education. This is a good example of the Ottoman segmented modernization operating at a personal level. Separate educations leading to the need to negotiate the relationship between the traditional and the modern at the individual level. In his last year in high school, Goldcap survived a suicide attempt, later acknowledging that the suicide, to use the Durkheimian terminology, was anomic. His individual psychological problems had close ties with the state of social anomy, or normlessness and confusion in the Ottoman Empire. Interesting. So basically, he tried to kill himself because he was confused because the world around him was confusing, right? Interesting. Interesting. After high school, he attended the veterinary school Mulki Bata Mekteb i Alisi in 1896. But because of his involvement in politics and his consequent imprisonment, he never had a chance to receive a university degree. After being introduced to members of Union and Progress, which was operating secretly at the time against the rule of Abdul Hamid II and for the restoration of the 1876 Constitution, his interest in Turkish history and the Turkish movement also emerged. After about 2 years in prison, he was sent back to Diyarbakir. He acquired government posts there despite, or perhaps because of, his Union and Progress membership, because the party had close relations with provincial notables. After being elected to the Central Committee of the party in 1910, Goldcap moved to Thessaloniki, where the headquarters of Union and Progress was located. He kept his prestigious position until the party annulled itself at the end of World War I. Despite his important position within the party ranks, however, Zia Goldkap never involved himself deeply in party politics. Because of his interest in giving public lectures, Goldkap came to be known more as an ideologue of the party than as a politician. He moved to Istanbul when the party headquarters moved there in 1912. In Istanbul, the first sociology professorship was given to Goldkap at the University of Istanbul. While productively publishing books and articles on Turkism, Westernization, and Islamism, he also advised the Union in Progress government. After the end of the war, sorry, I got to sneeze. Apologies. All right. So, after the end of the war, Goldcap was exiled to Malta. These years in exile, 1919 to 1922, became an opportunity for him to rethink and revise his nationalism. Now that Istanbul was occupied by British troops and the Ottoman Empire was under foreign threat, Turkism had gained more credibility vis-a-vis Islamism and Ottomanism. After the successful nationalist liberation, he returned to Diyarbakir and continued writing for journals and newspapers. However, when the nationalism U.S. government called him to work at the Ministry of Education. He moved to Ankara in 1923. He was selected to the first Grand Nationalist Assembly and participated in the preparation of the 1924 Constitution until his death on October 25th of that same year. The socio-cultural theory of Zia Golkap revolves around a central problematic, constructing a viable synthesis of Turkism, Islamism, and modernism while identifying the boundaries between them. Thus, Zia Golkap argued the first rule of our social order should be this sentence: I am of the Turkish nation, of the Islamic Ummah, of Western civilization. This was said by Golkap in 1969, or is it from 1923, but it was written down in 1969? Either way, this is his quote. The first rule of the social order should be this sentence: I am of the Turkish nation, of the Islamic Ummah, of Western civilization. However, his complex synthesis was probably not very well understood among the political elite. In fact, as opposed to his more popular writings and lectures, his theoretical works were usually either ignored or distorted in political circles. Understanding Golkap's social idea requires establishing a link between his ideas and the positivist sociology of the period, especially the sociology identified with the work of Emile Durkheim, Auguste Comte, and Ferdinand Tönnies. The Durkheimian sociology of the 19th century took questions of harmony and maintaining social order as the principal social issues. Golkap was influenced by this view, which saw modern society as a biological organism with separate but interdependent parts. His analysis looked at social institutions in terms of their contribution to the overall functioning of a social body, of the nation. Thus, the triangle of Turkism, Islamism, and modernism, rather than being contradictory, could be consistent when considered as separate but interdependent domains of social life. Turkism for Golkap was a cultural ideal, which was part of a universal political concept, nationalism. Thus, in Golkap's view, nationalism was to create a mosaic-like world picture in which nations occupied a national territory and maintained a clearly delineated national culture. The Islamic ideal, in his theory too, served less as a guide to action than an abstract sense of morality. Social norms that were derived from Turkish and Islamic values would maintain social solidarity against enemy. Right. And once again, because today we are looking up the words, I just want to be absolutely clear on enemy and its meaning. Let's look it up. So, enemy, the lack of usual social or ethical standards in an individual or group. The theory that high rise architecture leads to enemy in the residents. Okay, so basically, it's like the what's it called? Basically devolution into degeneracy is enemy. That's a very useful word for some degree. Ah, my nose is falling apart. Nose is falling apart right here. Anyway, where were we? Where were we? All right. Inserting modernization into this theoretical system, however, posed questions that were more difficult. Relying on a sense of Turkish exceptionalism, which turned into an indispensable element in the hands of the Republican modernizers, he argued that extensive individual freedoms and representative parliamentary democracy were unfit for implementation in the Turkish context. The source of modernism for Golkap had to be Western science and technology, keeping out Western individualism and liberalism. He called this selective amalgam of ideas social idealism. İçtimai mefiko, I cannot read that. That's a long Turkish word. All right. Zia Golkap's distinction between culture, hars, and civilization, Medeyinyet, okay, gave an analytical justification to his ideal social system. According to Golkap, culture is national while civilization is international. While each nation can have only a single culture, civilization can be shared. Moreover, he viewed culture as the communal product of members of a nation, which made culture natural. Very interesting. Okay, I just want to reread that because this is a very interesting idea. Zia Golkap's distinction between culture and civilization gave an analytical justification to his ideal social system. According to Golkap, culture is national while civilization is international. Okay. While each nation can have only a single culture, civilization can be shared. Okay. Moreover, he viewed culture as the communal product of members of a nation, which made culture natural. Just as the organic life of plants and animals appears in a natural manner, the creation and continuation of cultural phenomenon, occur in exactly the same way. Uh, Very interesting. Civilization, on the contrary, came into being by individual effort and creativity. Thus, what separates culture from civilization is that culture especially consists of emotions, while civilization consists of knowledge. A nation cannot imitate another's religious, moral, and aesthetic emotions. Borrowing Western science and technology, civilization, in this view, could be accomplished without adopting Western culture. The Tanzimat elites' rejection of Turkism and their adoption of cosmopolitan Ottomanist model was, for Golkap, a grave error. Ottomanism was nothing but an anachronism in an empire faced with separatist movements. Importing Western culture would prove impossible since he believed that cultures are specific to nations. Even the reception of civilization, Golkap argued, could not occur independently from national culture. A civilization assumes the form of a harmonious unity only if it is instilled into a national culture. Rather than seeking to replace culture with civilization, the Tanzimat, according to Golkap, should have taken only those parts of Western civilization that could adapt to Turkish culture. Contradictions between the national culture and adopted civilization might lead to the emergence of fragmented national traditions. Late Ottoman society, Golkap claimed, was dominated by such contradictions. The important necessity for Golkap was to keep the essence of national culture when confronted with a foreign civilization. Civilization would have a corruptive influence on the purity of culture. He believed that a nation with a strong culture and a weak civilization to be superior to one with high civilization but a corrupt culture. Okay, this is a very interesting point of view. Okay, uh, I'm sort of like, I don't like to use the term civilization, right? But I think, there is some homogeneity among certain sections of the world. And I've seen this from my travels, right? Like, I'm in Hungary right now. I could hop on a train tomorrow and be in Austria in like a few hours. And the difference between Budapest and Vienna are not that wide, right? When I was in Asia and I went from, Kuala Lumpur to Jakarta, the difference of civilization is not that wide. Now, by and large, those are like mostly like the same people, right? But I would like to know what y'all think. Is there a difference between culture and civilization? Okay. Anyway, this guy Golkap, he viewed, the idea that Turkey should be unified around this Ottoman idea. We're multi-cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic people. That's what makes our state this diverse state. He said that's false because that cannot hold together these groups of people who already have their nationalist goals. The Arabs want a state for the Arabs, the Armenians want a state for the Armenians, et cetera, et cetera. We can't hold it together with this kumbaya sort of thing, right? He was hell bent on the idea that, Turkey needs to be a place for Turkish people because nationalism is sort of like natural to people. And the culture of the Turks needs to be preserved and not just importing a distant civilization because those two things don't usually match together, right? That's why I'm interpreting what that text says here. Once again, sorry I'm sneezing so much. Let's jump ahead here. So, Goldcap's social model, with its excessive emphasis on harmony and solidarity, carried fascistic undertones. However, it is important to distinguish Goldcap's theory from the cultural models of fascism. Politically speaking, Zia Goldcap's political model never reached a level of irredentist, expansionist, hostile Turkic unity. Rather, Goldcap supported a pluralistic ideal of the international coexistence of particular national cultures and universal international civilization. Culture, as he understood it, comes into being through the collective and popular action of the people, not the actions of the elite. Therefore, solidarity with a blend of populism and idealism was the leitmotif of Goldkap's overall social theory. Zia Goldkap ideologically had deep influences on Union and Progress and Republican circles. Fali Rifki Atay, an important figure among the Republican elite, writes that through his Kuchik Mek Mua, a journal Goldcap published between 1922 and 1923, Goldcap directs from Diyarbakir the trends of thought in Istanbul. Yet, in another sense, the influence of Goldcap on the Union and Progress movement and the Kemalists were indirect, because his theory was misinterpreted in many significant ways. The members of the Union and Progress movement preferred a cosmopolitan eclecticism that rejected traditional, national, and Islamic values. The Kemalists, continuing in the same tradition, adopted a rather crude version of Goldcap's positivism and nationalism. Goldcap's theoretical and methodological devices were adapted by Republican modernizers to justify an interventionist and elitist social and cultural model. A distorted selection of slogans replaced Goldcap's social and cultural theory in the Republican era. Nevertheless, even such distorted appropriations suffice to display historical continuities between the policies of the Committee of Union and Progress era and the Republican political project. Very, very interesting. Oh, I already broke it down. I'm just going to jump ahead. So, the formation of the terrible Turk, Western perceptions. While the Ottomans' interest in race had origins outside the empire, a more indirect but no less significant influence had to do with the Western perceptions of Turks and Ottoman perceptions of these perceptions. This section examines popular perceptions of Turkey and Turks held by Western audiences and investigate how these images might have shaped the construction of chromatic Turkishness, while distinguishing broad popular Western images from scholarly discourses. It is important to note that scholarly research both created and mirrored the perceptions of Turkey and Turks. One should note that the images of Turks were not completely independent of images of the East or Muslims in general. The image of the terrible Turk was so vivid in the first half of the 20th century that Westerners who discussed it almost always framed their objections as a radical conversion experience, no less radical than the narrative of Republican conversion. The crux of the narrative rested on a prior sense of misinformation, fed by popular opinions, challenged by a deeper, concealed reality that materializes upon contact with Turks. In order to illustrate the power of this image and the abruptness of conversion, I will quote Chester Tobin's experiences at length here. Tobin was an American who worked as the coach of Turkish Olympic track and field team in 1924. Sorry, gotta sneeze again. My nose is killing me. Sorry about that. Oh, very okay. So let's go. The European cliche of the terrible Turk had been sharply imprinted on the minds of Americans by the close of the First World War. It was cast in human baseness. The purposes of the Western world had required this pattern of hate and fear as a psychological weapon of war. After the war, when I had returned to the complete sorry, after the war, when I had returned to complete my college education, an an Armenian woman addressed our college assembly and told in graphic language of the atrocious Armenian massacres and how she herself had been outraged and raped innumerable times by the despicable Turks. My youthful blood literally boiled as I listened to this sordid story. The perpetrators were scarcely human beings. They deserved no quarter. I was indoctrinated with this pattern, along with all college youth and even the general American public. This cliche of the terrible Turk was exploited to coerce the churches to support the war in the insidious campaign to get the United States to take a mandate over a section of Turkey that was to be made a free state of Armenia. No one I knew seemed to understand that it was serving the unrevealed selfish interests of the European Allied powers. After meeting with the Turkish track team, my spoon fed theories quickly collapsed. The more I became acquainted with these terrible Turks, the more I realized the potentialities of these countrymen of the great revolutionary hero Mustafa Kemal Pasha, as he was then called, Tobin, 1944. All right. The image of the terrible Turk resonated in the minds of travelers. A British author and diplomat, Harold Armstrong, who served in military posts in the Allied army during the occupation of Istanbul and later published critical accounts of the new regimes and its leaders, recounts the widespread image of Turkey in the 1930s as follows. Diplomats, consuls, and businessmen had warned me of the irritations and even of the dangers of landing in modern Turkey. Ordinary travelers, they said, met with rudeness. My work would make me unpopular, and I must expect active hostility. No one could say what the Turks would do under any special circumstance. They seemed afraid of the Turks and to look on them much as they were looked on in the 16th century as the terrible Turk, as something inhuman, not to be dealt with as a man to man, but as terrifying as wild animals, with which it is impossible to get into touch or sympathy, to reason with, or to arrive at compromises. The image of the terrible Turk was not formulated in reference to mutable social conditions of a particular period, although discursive formations that came into existence during the Armenian massacres and the secession of Greeks from the Ottomans appeared to be the main reasons for the anti-Turkish views in the 20th century. These views connected to centuries-old stereotypes that were hardly social. The terrible Turk, as it historically evolved, referred to immutable characteristics of an alien other. For that reason, it is not surprising to encounter stereotypical accounts of Turks operating along darkness, both metaphorically and in terms of physical complexion. A noteworthy account of Turkish racial perceptions in Selma Ekrem's 1931 autobiography entitled Unveiled. Ekrem is the granddaughter of Namik Kemal, an influential young Ottoman figure whose emotional theater plays still occupies an eminent place in nationalist literature. The book narrates Ekrem's travels with her family outside of Istanbul, including her trip to the United States, where she lived as a speaker on Turkey from 1923 until her death. The book gives a colorful account of Americans' amazement upon finding that she was a Turk. No one believed that I was a Turk. The same astonishment followed in every place. I could not be a Turk. I was not the type. And when I asked what the type was, the Americans seemed lost to answer me. Some said they thought all the Turks had black hair and black eyes, and I, being fair, could not be a real Turk. Surely I must be mistaken. And then I realized why no one believed me. Here in America lived a legend made of blood and thunder. The terrible Turk ruled the minds of the Americans. A huge person with fierce black eyes and bushy eyebrows, carrying daggers covered with blood. Oh, God. I did not fit into the legend of the terrible Turk, and so I was not one. In fact, many people were disappointed to meet a real Turk who turns out to be fair, meek, and not very unlike an American. Very interesting. I think my wife has a similar story, like her going to Europe and people saying, "Oh, you don't look Turkish," right? So the image of the terrible Turk was undoubtedly a gendered one. Ekrem's description above indicates that the Turk, on one hand, was imagined as a violent man who was not fit for living in a civilized milieu. On the other hand, the concept of civilization itself was conceptualized in such a way that acquiring it required a male subjectivity. Analyzing Turkey's transformation in the 1930s and sensing the feminization of the non-Western Orient, an Anglo-Saxon author recommends the Turkish elite to opt for what he believes is the more masculine vein in Western civilization. Civilization, science, and pragmatism are imagined in masculine characteristics. Anglo-Saxon and Teutonic cultures seem to us the most masculine in the West and best able to furnish Turkey strength in her rebuilding. French culture has long existed in Istanbul, but has been of little practical value to Turkey. French culture and French literature tend to be dainty and refined. The language is pretty, and French influence can lend a people considerable charm and a polished veneer. But Turkey realizes now that it is not grace that she needs, it is science and work. As she studies the Anglo Saxon and Teutonic cultures, she notices that they emphasize scientific method and energetic endeavor. It is strength and creative activity rather than appreciation of beautiful that Turkey needs now and expects to learn from America, England, and Germany. A picture presented in Selma Ekrem's Unveiled is striking in that it presents a symbolic meeting of the East and the West in visually gendered terms. The picture displays Ekrem, who was not veiled since childhood, and her sister, who appears fully covered. The oppression of Eastern women in veil is a common theme employed along this dichotomy of Western versus Eastern attire. The comparison between the East and the West does not only take place across a dichotomy dichotomy of civilized versus uncivilized dress, because the picture also depicts Ekram in male clothes, whereas her sister is covered from head to toe. The picture helps the readers visualize the difference between the West and the East, not only in terms of progress, but also in terms of gendered difference. In the Orientalist imagery of the early 20th century, Western authors paid careful attention to distinguish between the cosmopolitan Ottoman citizenry, citizenry and the real Turks of the Anatolian heartland, hence helping the Republican elite create a racial myth of the people from which the regime acquired its justification and legitimacy. Harold Armstrong utilizes the distinctions between Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and the rest of Turkey to illustrate the myth of the real Turk. As I wandered about the city, I searched for this stout old Turk I had learned to know in Anatolia. He was not there. Gradually, I realized that in Constantinople there were no Turks, for they were all Levantines, and that herein lay the basic and fundamental problem of Turkey. Away in Anatolia were 7 million ignorant Turkish peasants. They were hardy, honest, and steady, but should any one of them be taken and educated, he instinctively absorbed that which was superficial, and he became a Levantine. Okay, sorry. Oh, sorry about that. That was gross. I don't think anybody's watching or listening now, so that's going to live in obscurity. But if you're the one person who saw that happen on screen, you can leave a comment roasting me for that. You can leave a comment saying, I saw that at the 1 hour and 40-minute mark. Somebody saw that. That's definitely one of the grossest things that's ever happened on live stream. But this is the great thing about not being famous on YouTube. When you're not being famous on YouTube, I can get away with saying stuff and doing stuff in videos that nobody's going to know about because I have a bunch of obscure work. So this is great. I love it. Oh, man. Anyway, similarly, in a chapter entitled Fatma and Mehmed, Ozzy says, I'm listening but not watching the video, so I missed it. Okay, good. I'm glad you missed it. Anyway, continuing here. Similarly, in a chapter entitled Fatma and Mehmed, selected as typical Turkish names, a book by an American sociologist and self acclaimed Turkophile seeks real essences of Republican Turkey among peasants. Terrible Turk and Unspeakable Turk have been used for so long as compound words that many Americans have been misled into thinking of these adjectives as accurately applicable. No concept is falser, no use of language could be more deceptive to him who knows them as acquaintances and friends. Typical Turks, Fatma and Mehmed, the established equivalents of our Mary and John, are as charming as any Westerner and more hospitable than the average American. My residence in Turkey has made me more conscious of similarities and the traits common to all mankind than of the slight differences between Turks and Westerners. In the same passage, the author pursues his argument of commonality by introducing racial similarities between Turks and Westerners. This gesture, challenging Western stereotypes of Turks' racial characteristics while internalizing the undesirability of dark skins at face value, presents a common trope in the Turkophile literature. When one lands in Istanbul or Izmir from a ship which he boarded in Greece or Italy, he finds that not only the scenery, but also the faces and physiques of the people are strikingly similar to those seen elsewhere in the Mediterranean world. If this be the first surprise, the second will be occasioned by the number of persons having blue eyes. There are even some who expect to find a population of African hue. There are some Negroes in Turkey, but not so many as in Minnesota. Slight differences are noted, however, as one travels eastward. The idea of racial similarity between Turks and Europeans, the centerpiece of racial thinking in Republican Turkey, operated as a powerful argument in the hands of Western authors who strive to counter the dominant stereotype of the terrible Turk and its image of permanent difference. As both late Ottoman and Republican elites realized, racial commonality seemed to be one of the surest ways to accomplish the cherished civilizational advances of the West. Eminent historian Arnold J. Toynbee 1889 to 1975, employs the discourse of racial similarity in his 1927 book, Turkey, as follows. Accordingly, he, the Westerner, receives a shock when his Turk turns out to be a white man. Sorry, sorry. Ah. All right, so this American historian says, accordingly, he, the Westerner, receives a shock when his Turk turns out to be a white man, indistinguishable in figure, features, color, and countenance, with a native of Transalpine Europe. No doubt many readers of this book will have seen pictures of Mustafa Kemal and have wondered whether, in physical appearance, the president of the Turkish Republic was typical of his nation. The answer is in the affirmative. The blonde, gray eyed, fair skinned, straight nosed type of Alpine or even Nordic physique is perhaps more common among the Turks than the brunette Mediterranean, and it completely prevails over the Mongoloid type, in which contemporary Turkey is rare, though it does occur in the inner of Anatolia or the interior of Anatolia. The gestures of racial similarity perturbed some authors who were more critical. For Harold Armstrong, for example, even racial similarity would not bear a successful mixture of the East and West. Anatolia and Constantinople are Eastern, and there is great danger of treating them as if they were Western, because their people have white skins and some are Christians. Armstrong, 1925, 79. Uh, the rigid symbolic boundaries drawn between the East and the West permanently characterize Turks as essential others, despite the fervent campaigns by the Turkish elite and Turkophile Westerners about their racial makeup or the country's material progress. It is not difficult to imagine the frustrations this must have caused among the Republican elite. Even the systemic adoption of Western science and technology, manners, laws, and patterns of behavior were prone to suspicions because these changes, seen merely superficial, were not considered sufficient to convert the essential spirit of Easternness dominant in Turkey. East and West mate badly, argues Armstrong in his memoirs. They do not absorb each other satisfactorily. I found that the East respected not the spirit, but the material results of Western civilization, its motor cars, its luxuries, and above all, the power and comfort that it gives. This idea of inherent superficiality and cold calculation in Turkey's westernization created a discourse which viewed all efforts to modernize as nothing more than mixing the unmixable. The best that would come out of it was an unfitting couple of modern and non-modern sitting side by side. Describing a Turkish prison, Armstrong quips, suddenly an electric light was turned on, and I saw that I was in a narrow, short, but long. Uh, Negative stereotypes about Turks are not recent creations, especially after their capture of Constantinople in 1453. Turks in the West were seen as the representatives of the infidel Muslims' expansion in Christendom. News of Turkish cruelty during and after the siege of Constantinople reached all corners of Europe, and the image of the scourge of God was attached to the Turks permanently. As Schäuble points out, the medieval image of Islam was later assigned to the Ottomans in a more or less continuous line. Thus, through the Crusade appeals, the view of Islam developed in the Middle Ages was carried over to the Ottomans and perpetuated even after the main lines of the medieval world view had crumbled. All right. All right. Trying to get through chapter 3 here. Trying to get through chapter 3 here. And probably cut this short because my nose is like really bothering me. I don't think I can get through this, because it seems to be getting worse with my sneezing and stuff like that. But very interesting that the Europeans would have negative images of Islam, and how can you really blame them? Because the Arabs and then the Turks, invaded Europe. The Arabs went into Spain, the Turks went into the Balkans and stuff like that. So they fought with the Muslims for hundreds of years. So it's not uncommon to think that, or it's not surprising to know that they might have negative views of their sworn enemies, right? Continuing here. In the process, Turks emerged as the epitome of the East. In her study of the image of the Turk in French thought, Rouillard argues it is an indisputable fact that the Turk was the first and remained the chief symbol of the Orient and franchise during the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. The Muslim character occupied a central place in English literature too, especially in travel accounts, plays, and histories. In European accounts, not only all Muslims but also all infidels were lumped under a singular framework. For example, in some literary works, Muslim Jewish association appears as a common trope. A German theologian and a collaborator of Martin Luther, Philip Melanchthon, believed that Turks were red Jews. Similarly, no distinctions were made between the Iranians, Turks, North Africans, and Huns. A common theme in British literary works was belligerence and bloodshed associated with Turks. In 47 instances of Elizabethan drama that featured Oriental characters, the Turk appears in 31, described as valiant, proud spirited, and cruel. Demonizing representations of the Turks in British drama revolved around fears of conversion with Christian to Turk. Turks and Muslims were undifferentiated, as the flesh, the Church of Rome, and the Turk were all believed to be material means for the devil to achieve his ends. Conversion was equated with eternal damnation. Margaret Spone outlines German prejudices and stereotypes about Turks in the last 500 years in four types of narratives: religious, musical, travel, and educational. For Spone, the religious establishment, whether Catholic or Protestant, spread negative views about Turks. Especially for the Catholic Church, Turks were important to maintain the power of the Church against Protestant challenges. For the Protestant Church, however, fear of Turks would help impose a penance on sinners. When Luther, in a prayer, equated the Pope and the Turks in cruelty, it was not clear which one he considered worse. Keep your promise for us, our Lord, and protect us from the murder of the Pope and the Turks. They wanted to dethrone your son Jesus Christ. Okay. Especially history education functioned as the link to carry over these 500-year-old stereotypes into contemporary German culture. Although in religious and non-religious popular songs, the cruelty of Turks was invariably one of the central themes. The elites who had a chance to see operas and plays were exposed to an image of the Turk which was sometimes depicted in positive light. Accounts focusing on the uh, alterity alterity of Turks coexisted with universalist accounts that revolved around the idea of an essence that was to be found equally in both the Europeans and the Ottomans. It is possible to think that some of these positive expressions were an attempt to satirize or correct the shortcomings of Frenchmen or of Christians in general. All right. The shared essence for some was the chivalrous spirit. Since some Europeans were unable to distinguish Turkish soldiers from Western knights because of the fundamental lack of the middle in the Middle Ages of any proper understanding of the diversity of men and things. Others drew upon a religious essence, relying on a conviction that Turks would eventually convert to Christianity. Anabaptist preachers in the 16th century, for example, believed that Turks were simply being true to their own nature, and resisting them was unnecessary because they too had a place in God's plan for salvation. Accounts of radical difference and similarity seem to contradict each other, but they both operated in the Orientalist exoticism of later periods. Negative images concentrating on differences led to feelings of revulsion, whereas assumed similarities led to feelings of indifference. As the Ottoman military superiority started to falter, European images of the Turks changed from the terror of the world to the sick man of Europe. With the European domination emerged the Orientalist imagery that used the framework of similarity and difference and an unstoppable desire to know, classify, and govern. Islam continued to be seen as an unchanging mentality. And Turks continued to be essentially equated with all other Muslims. For example, a book with suggestions for Christian missionaries operating in Republican Turkey presents the image of a Muslim mentality. Prejudices about Islam and Muslims were alive despite the rise of exotic curiosity. So far as Europe was concerned, the basic Christian attitude was still what it had been for a millennium: a rejection of the claim of Muslims that Muhammad was a prophet and the Quran the word of God, mingled with memory of periods of fear and conflict, and also a few thinkers and scholars apart, with legends usually hostile and often contemptuous. However, only by putting the Orientalist curiosity and old hatreds into a political context can we find out how disdain for the East can operate as a project of territorial and economic expansion. All right. Sorry, everybody. Woo! My nose is just running. I think I might be sick. I need tissue. I need help. Oh God. All right. So anyway, uh, American author and war correspondent E. Alexander Powell, 1879, 1957, in his New Frontiers of Freedom, places the occupation of Istanbul by Allied powers at the end of World War I in colonialist framework. Although Turkey was never formally colonized, the view of advanced West spreading freedom to incompetent locals was rampant after the war. Powell cites the sickness of the Ottoman society as a justification for colonial domination. Beautiful though Constantinople is, it combines the moral squalor of southern Europe with the physical squalor of the Orient to a greater degree than any city in the Levant. Though it has assumed the outward appearance of a well organized and fairly well administered municipality since its occupation by the Allies, one has but to scratch this thin veneer to discover that the filth and vice and corruption and misgovernment which characterized it under Ottoman rule still remain. Should the United States decide to accept the mandate for Constantinople, a resident remarked to me, the burned districts would give her an opportunity to start rebuilding the city on modern sanitary lines. And he might have added, at American expense. The Ottoman Empire and later the Republic of Turkey occupied a position of a Muslim and Eastern otherness within these crisscross discourses of Orientalist exoticism and prejudices. The spread of news across Europe and North America about Turkish cruelty to suppress nationalist movements within the Ottoman Empire, notably the Greek and Armenian nationalisms, operated as symbolically important events in this context, since they helped reinforce stereotypes that equated Turks with barbarism. The symbolic significance of Turkish maltreatment of Christian Europeans led to the rise of anti Turkish feelings and mobilization. A people capable of such barbarity, people in Europe and North America thought, ought no longer be permitted to sully Europe with their presence. They ought to be driven back into those savage Anatolian regions whence they came. The reception of Western perceptions, more than the content of prejudices, matter because modernization for both the Ottoman and Republican elite muted, uh, meant, sorry, uh, because modernization for both the Ottoman and Republican elite meant to a great extent westernization. Sorry. The West, however, imagined constituted the main audience to judge Turks' progress in the road of modernity. A few centuries earlier, Ottoman rulers could afford ignoring European views of Turkish cruelty because the balance of power between the West and the Ottomans was not so asymmetrical, both for the late Ottoman and especially the early Republican elite. Turkish modernizers were painfully aware of stereotypical presentations of the terrible Turk, as well as the rising tide of exotic interest in Turkey. Many travel accounts written by Europeans in this period revolve around this tension between a foreigner in search of exotic and real Turkey and local elites stubbornly insisting on showing the modernized face of Turkey. The Western traveler was in search of confirming Orientalist images, whereas Turkish modernizers sought Western confirmation of Turkey's progress. This question of representation, what really represents Turkey, is still at the heart of debates around Turkey's contemporary touristic image. Should Turkey present the mosques and narrow back streets as examples of real Turkey, or the modern shopping malls and freeways? In a provocatively titled 1936 travel account, Allah Dethroned, A Journey Through Modern Turkey, German author Lilo Link narrates this tension between a tourist in search of exotic Turkey and an army officer striving to show Turkey's modernization. I told Najat that I should like to see whatever still existed of ancient Trabzon, legendary capital of the Pontic Empire. I remembered stories of beautiful princesses for whose favorite kings and heroes had fought in gorgeous tournaments, of camel caravans laden with the treasures of the Orient, and of sailing ships from all over the world piercing the sky with their tall masts. You love that. You love that? He was full of contempt and indignation. You are just like American tourists. They creep here, nose in the sand, look for past. I tell you, past is dead. We had war, all dark. Then came sun, Ataturk. Sun passed away, all dark. Sun made new Turkey. Cum Hurriyet, Republic. Now we follow Ataturk. Ileri, Ileri, Daima, Ileri. Forward, forward, always forward. ah, anyway, Turkish modernizers were also aware that the stereotypes about the lack of civilization in Turkey were racial. The terrible Turk referred, as they understood, to unchanging characteristics of Turks rather than temporary social conditions. We should see the following outcry of a Republican poet, Behçet Kemal Çağlar, in the context of deep resentment towards Western perceptions. Do Not Call a Race That Deserved Divinity Barbarian, a book authored in 1938 by a member of the official Turkish Historical Society for the purpose of evaluating the gains of the Republic in its 14 years, sets out to answer perceived Western claims about the Turks' lack of prosperity to make progress. The strong and brilliant appearance of our reforms, which in our national history took place from those wonderful days that are called the independence struggle to today, and each of which would be sufficient to create a new age in itself. This 15-year-old history of our reforms refuted, rejected in reality, and contradicted the claims and theories that were put forth in the past, both by our friends and our enemies, along the lines of Turks are no good, the racial capabilities of Turks are not fit for progress. All right. All right. Sorry. All right, chromatic Turkishness was a response to the European image of chromatic Turkishness was a response to the European images of subhuman Turk. Both the Ottoman and the Republican ruling elite were aware of these perceptions, especially after the second half of the 19th century. A significant amount of effort was spent to disprove Western accusations. The consequence was a chronic sense of injustice. A recurrent theme appears in establishing the idea of the loneliness of Turks when confronting the entire world. Westerners' inability or unwillingness to understand Turks properly. Charges of misunderstanding slowly led to a social paranoia. The discourse of Westernization as the only way out of Western domination coexisted with a deep sense of mistrust of and a fear of misunderstanding by the West. Although modernization in Turkey was not imposed by Western military force, it would be far fetched to argue that it was entirely an autonomous and internal development. It is true that Turkish nationalism did not serve as a tool of liberation from colonial domination. However, the Turkish elite negotiated with the powerful and resilient discourse of the terrible Turk that made the development of an endogenous project of modernization extremely difficult. The problem of periodization. Social phenomenon extend across time and space. The previous section gives a brief glimpse of how the development of Turkishness is not necessarily an insider's job. Diverse groups ranging from European and North American Orientalists and Turkologists to Russian emigre Muslim intellectuals and Hungarian Turanian scholars made direct contributions to the emergence of Turkishness in the Ottoman Empire. Similar forms of interactions and influences took place across borders in the Republican encounters with chromatic Turkishness. It is also important to note the realignment or restructuring of social life do not involve movements when something comes out of nothing. Racial discourses in the Republican were not born anew in the Republican era. Nor, as we will see later, did they die after the end of World War II. Many familiar themes, such as the racial purity and the superiority of the Turks, the ancientness of Turkish language, and the Turkish contributions to Western civilization, kept being recycled. In this sense, the content of the Republican discourse of Turkishness was not entirely original. Its message was new, yet followed what had happened before, the lines of Ottoman Turkism. We can talk about the beginning of a new era for Turkism when its discursive alternatives become impossible not only to implement but even to imagine. Consequently, we need to turn to counterfactuals to see how what might have happened became what in fact occurred, how the determinative power of the past and the openings afforded by the contingency are interwoven into the story of Turkish identity. Some classic works on Ottoman and Middle Eastern history assume inevitable demise and breakdown in the face of pressure from Western progress. But assuming the inevitability of decline in the history of the Ottoman Empire neglects the contemporary actors' points of view. For the human being in the 1990s, Dominic Levin argues, it is not easy to conceive of a world in which the Ottoman Empire continues to exist and the USA does not. The imagination fails in part because in such a world, so many of the values and ideological assumptions currently taken as self-evident would be turned on their heads. A corollary of this argument is that we need to reject perceiving modernization as a necessity materialized through the West's imposition of itself on stagnant ancient societies. The decline and collapse of the Ottoman Empire appears natural only from today's perspective, when our historical narratives look for patterns of determinacy and paths of direction within the messy details of historical trajectories. And the Republican narrative itself presented a picture in which the transformations in the post 1923 period appear self induced, the product of an inevitable decline that, however, leads to a fundamental rupture to conversion and change. However, in this story, we find both the object and the subject of change interacting in a closed system of action and reaction. Sorry. All right, the ghost of the Ottoman past loiters in the background, representing the remnants of a time that the storyteller both want to omit yet cannot avoid in its uncanny presence. Paradoxically, taking this conversion narrative seriously requires that we question it at the same time, because a cursory look at the narrative of the Republican storytellers who shouldered the delicate and risky task of fabricating a past for the purpose of justifying the present reveals that they themselves were products of the late Ottoman period. Ottoman Turkism was one of the several possibilities that the elites formulated to save the state and deal with perceived social problems. Yet it was neither the only nor the most powerful contender. Before dealing with the racial underpinnings of Turkish identity in the following chapters, then it is necessary to acknowledge that for the social actors of the period, there was nothing inevitable in the rise of Turkishness. We need to guard against confusing the questions and why and how did a seemingly unlikely alternative turn into the dominant paradigm in a few decades with a deterministic answer, because it had to be that way. If a significant number of social actors in Ottoman society were entertaining the possibility of a future with the Ottoman state intact, these counterfactuals need to be considered in order to appreciate the magnitude of the historical rupture and the embedded continuities in it. Part of the Ottoman elite insisted on clinging to the idea of an imperial identity, of Ottomanness, despite increasing territorial losses, separatist nationalisms, and the increasing intrusion of the Western powers. The Ottoman Muslims elites had high stakes involved in maintaining and modernizing the empire, and in general clung to Ottomanism as long as there was an empire to cling to. Most Ottomans well into the early 20th century would probably have never imagined living in a state that claimed racial, linguistic, and ethnic homogeneity. Wow. All right. Although the Turkish War of Independence in the 1920s eventually led to the consolidation of the Turkish nationalism and the establishment of the Republican regime in 1923. It was fought to save the last bastion of Islam against infidel invasion in the eyes of Anatolian peasants as well as in the eyes of the nationalists to be elites. Until as late as 1926, the Turkish parliament witnessed deep ideological clashes between Turkish nationalists and those who still maintained their imperial and Islamic visions. After that, the parliamentary opposition went extinct, and the country appeared ready for the chromatic mobilization of the 1930s. Although I hasten to add, the transformation of large segments of the populace took much longer. There were obvious continuities between Ottoman Turkism and the Republican project of Turkishness in terms of the producers and the content. In fact, the first generation of Republican intellectuals and scholars were trained mainly during the Ottoman era. What we need to focus on, however, is not only what discourses existed and extended across time, but also on the condition and the capacity in which they prevailed. It is important to examine the discursive appeal of these ideas. How possible was it to enunciate these ideas in these two different periods? Despite the continuities of content, an important discontinuity appears in terms of influence, in terms of power and discursive appeal. There is a rupture marked by not there is a rupture marked by not by a moment. There's so many typos in this goddamn book. There is a rupture marked not by a moment, but by a period of transformation, roughly from the mid 1910s to the 1930s, when Turkishness emerged and became increasingly powerful as the ruling paradigm and claimed an all encompassing position of truth, jealousy protecting its political and cultural domain and decimating alternative discourses. And we finally wrapped up chapter 3. In our next live stream, we're going to finish up chapter 4, Race in Early Republican Turkey. Now we're actually getting to the meat and potatoes of this book. Sorry, I might be sick, guys. Sorry if this was a off and on, hot and cold type of stream. I wanted to give more input. I'll be breaking down what I read in chapter 3 more in the live stream tomorrow. But yeah, y'all let me know what you think of this book. Chapter 4, I believe there's about 10 chapters in this book. Is the Turk a White Man by Murat Ergin. We're continuing on this. I'll jump into this chapter 4, maybe even 5 tomorrow. And I will see you in the next live stream. Y'all be easy out there. And peace.